Manager humiliates an elderly customer, but when the truth is revealed, he is left in shock. Hello, welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It was a quiet morning in a suburban area of Seattle. Fresh Path, a supermarket known for its quality and connection to the community, was bustling as usual. Ellen, a woman in her early 70s, walked through the automatic doors with slow but steady steps. She wore a simple blue knit sweater and plain pants, carrying a worn leather purse. Her eyes scanned the surroundings with nostalgia, remembering when this supermarket was a symbol of care and unity for the local neighborhood. As she walked through the aisles, she noticed changes. The once warm and inviting atmosphere now felt cold and impersonal. Shelves were meticulously arranged, not for convenience but for maximizing sales. Employees, who used to greet customers with smiles, now appeared tense and avoided eye contact. Ellen sighed, feeling a pang in her chest. Upstairs, in a glass-walled office overlooking the sales floor, Steve, the store manager, was watching the activity below. Tall, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit and exuding an air of superiority, Steve was the type of person who saw people as numbers in a spreadsheet. When his eyes landed on Ellen, his face hardened with impatience. To him, she was just another elderly customer getting in the way. Steve descended quickly, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. He approached Ellen in the cereal aisle, where she was studying a shelf with quiet focus, and interrupted her in a sharp tone. "Ma'am, if you're not going to buy anything, can you please step aside? I have an entire store to run." Ellen looked up, surprised and confused by his rude tone. She tried to reply politely, explaining that she was revisiting the supermarket that she and her late husband had helped establish years ago. But Steve cut her off. "Look, I don't have time for sentimental stories. This is a business, not a museum. If you're not shopping, I suggest you find somewhere else to spend your time." A few nearby customers glanced over, drawn to the commotion. Ellen felt her face flush with embarrassment. Tears welled in her eyes, but she kept her composure. Clutching her purse tightly, she turned and began to walk toward the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last. Outside in the parking lot, Ellen sat on a bench near the entrance, her hands trembling. She tried to hold back tears, but the sting of Steve's public humiliation and cold indifference was too much to bear. Meanwhile, Robert, president of the Fresh Path supermarket chain and Ellen's son, arrived at the store for a surprise visit. Stepping out of his car, he immediately spotted his mother sitting on the bench, head bowed. He rushed over. "Mom, what happened? Are you okay?" Ellen, hesitant at first, recounted what had happened. Her voice was soft, but the weight of her words carried the full impact of her pain. Robert's expression darkened. His usual calm demeanor gave way to a quiet but intense anger. "Stay here. I'm going to handle this." He turned toward the store with determined strides, leaving Ellen on the bench, still trying to compose herself. Robert entered the store with purpose, his shoes striking the polished floor in sharp, deliberate steps. His eyes scanned the aisles until he spotted Steve, who was standing near the customer service desk, issuing orders to an employee. Steve, oblivious to what was coming, exuded his usual arrogance, gesturing brusquely as he corrected the worker on some minor mistake. Robert approached, his voice calm but firm. "Steve," he said, loud enough to catch the attention of nearby staff. Steve turned, startled to see the company president standing in front of him. His confident demeanor wavered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, forcing a smile. "Mr. Lawrence, what a surprise. I wasn't expecting you today." Robert didn't return the smile. Instead, his sharp gaze bore into Steve, making it clear that this wasn't a casual visit. "We need to talk now," Robert said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Steve hesitated but nodded, gesturing toward a small meeting room at the back of the store. As they walked, the tension in the air was palpable, with employees and customers subtly watching the two men disappear into the room. Inside, Robert closed the door firmly. "Do you know who the woman you just humiliated is?" Robert asked, his voice low but laced with anger. Steve frowned, confused. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't know what you mean." "She's my mother," Robert said, his tone like a whip crack. Steve's face paled. He stammered, I didn't realize." Robert cut him off. "You didn't realize because you didn't bother to ask. You didn't stop to think for 1 second about the person you were speaking to. My mother co-founded this store. Everything you see here, everything you take pride in managing, exists because of her vision and hard work. And you treated her with complete disrespect." Steve's hands clenched at his sides. "Sir, I'm not finished," Robert said sharply, his voice rising. "This store was built on values, respect, community, compassion. Values that clearly mean nothing to you." Steve looked down, his arrogance crumbling under Robert's reprimand. "From this moment on," Robert continued, "you're no longer the store manager. Consider yourself demoted to a janitorial position. Maybe by working alongside the people you've dismissed and disrespected, you'll learn some humility." Steve's mouth opened to protest, but he stopped himself, realizing the futility. "Do you understand?" Robert asked, his tone final. "Yes, sir," Steve said quietly, his usual bravado replaced with a rare sense of shame. Robert didn't wait for further acknowledgement. He opened the door and left without another word, the tension in the room lingering like a storm cloud. As Robert walked back through the store, employees whispered among themselves. His expression softened slightly when he saw Ellen still sitting on the bench outside, her posture defeated. He approached her, kneeling in front of her and placing a reassuring hand on hers. "It's done," he said softly. "You'll never have to experience that again." Ellen looked up at her son, her eyes still watery but now filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Robert," she said. But even as she spoke, she hesitated, a flicker of compassion crossing her face. "Be kind to him," she added. "People like that need to learn, not just be punished. Everyone deserves a chance to change." Robert nodded, though his jaw tightened. He respected his mother's boundless compassion, but he wasn't ready to let go of his anger just yet. "Let's get you home," he said gently, helping her to her feet. As they walked to the car, the supermarket behind them felt quieter, the weight of the confrontation lingering over everyone who had witnessed it. The drive back to Ellen's modest home was quiet. Robert occasionally glanced at his mother, whose gaze was fixed out the window. Her expression was calm, but Robert could sense the depth of her thoughts. Ellen had always been the embodiment of grace under pressure, a woman who believed in redemption even when others didn't. When they arrived, Ellen stepped out of the car and paused at the front door, turning to her son. "Thank you again," she said, her voice steady. "But don't let anger control your heart, Robert. It's a heavy burden to carry." Robert nodded, though he wasn't ready to let go of the lingering frustration. Ellen smiled faintly, patted his hand, and went inside, leaving Robert standing on the porch for a moment, deep in thought. Back at the supermarket, Steve stood alone in the janitor's closet, staring at the cleaning supplies that now represented his new role. His tailored suit felt out of place, and his pride felt even more misplaced. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the consequences of his arrogance. Reluctantly, he rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a mop, and walked onto the sales floor. Employees and customers alike glanced his way, some with surprise, others with thinly veiled satisfaction. Steve's grip tightened on the mop handle as he felt their judgment. The first task assigned to him was cleaning up a spill in the dairy aisle. As he worked, crouching down to wipe the sticky mess, a familiar voice spoke behind him. "Quite the change, isn't it?" Steve turned to see Carlos, one of the veteran stock clerks. Carlos had worked at FreshPath for over 2 decades and had been on the receiving end of Steve's sharp tongue more times than he could count. "Yeah," Steve muttered, keeping his eyes on the floor. Carlos crossed his arms, leaning slightly on the shelf. Funny thing is, most of us started just like this. Cleaning up spills, unloading trucks, helping customers. You skipped all that, didn't you? Steve didn't answer, but the truth in Carlos's words stung. You might actually learn something down here, Carlos continued, his tone softening slightly. But only if you're willing to. Steve looked up at him, his expression a mix of frustration and shame. Carlos gave a small nod, then walked away, leaving Steve alone with his thoughts once more. Meanwhile, Ellen sat in her small, cozy living room, sipping tea and flipping through an old photo album. Pictures of her late husband and the early days of Fresh Path brought a bittersweet smile to her face. Her thoughts drifted back to Steve. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his behavior than just arrogance. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Robert. "How are you doing, Mom?" he asked. "I'm fine, dear. Just thinking," she replied. "About Steve?" Robert guessed. Ellen chuckled lightly. "You know me too well. I just can't help but wonder what brought him to this point. No one becomes that bitter without a reason." Robert sighed on the other end of the line. "You're too forgiving, Mom. He disrespected you in a way that's unacceptable." "True," Ellen admitted. "But that doesn't mean he's beyond redemption. Give him the chance to prove he can change, Robert. Sometimes people just need someone to believe in them." Robert didn't respond immediately. He respected his mother's wisdom, but the idea of giving Steve another chance didn't sit well with him yet. "I'll think about it," he finally said, his tone reluctant. "Good," Ellen said warmly. "Now, stop worrying about me and get some rest. You've had a long day." After hanging up, Ellen stared out the window at the fading light of the evening. Somewhere deep down, she believed Steve could find a better path, if he was willing to take the first step. The next morning, Steve arrived at the supermarket early. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few employees starting their shifts. He stepped out of his car, now wearing a plain uniform instead of his tailored suit. It felt foreign, but also oddly grounding. As he walked toward the building, he caught his reflection in the glass doors. For the first time in years, he didn't see the confident, untouchable manager he had once prided himself on being. Instead, he saw a man trying to figure out where he went wrong. Inside, the store hummed with the usual morning routine. Steve headed to the janitor's closet, where Carlos was already organizing supplies. The older man looked up when Steve entered. "Back again, huh?" Carlos said, his tone neutral but with a hint of curiosity. "Yeah," Steve replied, avoiding his gaze as he grabbed a mop and bucket. Carlos paused, leaning against the counter. "You know, it's not about the mopping or the sweeping. It's about how you treat the people you work with while you're doing it." Steve frowned. "I'm just here to clean, Carlos. Let's leave it at that." Carlos shrugged. "Your call. But if you don't figure it out, you'll be stuck in this closet for a long time." Steve didn't respond. Instead, he wheeled the mop bucket out to the produce section, where a spill from an overturned display of oranges awaited. Later that morning, Ellen walked into the store. She hadn't planned to come back so soon, but something inside her told her it was necessary. She moved quietly through the aisles, greeting employees she recognized. When she reached the produce section, she froze. There was Steve, down on one knee, picking up oranges one by one. He worked methodically, his movements lacking the arrogance she had seen in him before. For a moment, she considered walking away, but instead, she stepped closer. "Steve," Ellen said softly. He looked up, startled to see her. He quickly stood, brushing off his hands. "Mrs. Lawrence," he said, his voice uncertain. I didn't expect to see you here." Ellen smiled gently. "I come here often. This place is special to me. Steve nodded, his gaze falling to the floor. "I'm sorry," he said abruptly. "For how I treated you. I was wrong, and I know that now." Ellen studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "It's a good start, Steve. Apologizing is important, but it's not the end of the journey." Steve looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She gestured to the produce section. "This store isn't just a place to sell groceries. It's part of a community. Every person here, employee or customer, deserves to be seen and respected. You lost sight of that, and now you have the chance to find it again." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Steve didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded. Ellen reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You've got a long road ahead, Steve, but I believe you can walk it. And if you ever need guidance, you know where to find me." With that, Ellen turned and walked away, leaving Steve standing alone among the scattered oranges. For the first time, her words didn't feel like a reprimand. They felt like a lifeline. By the end of the day, Steve had finished cleaning and was organizing the storage room. His mind replayed Ellen's words over and over. He thought about the employees he had ignored, the customers he had dismissed, and the values he had abandoned in his climb to the top. Carlos poked his head into the storage room. "Hey, a few of us are grabbing coffee after work. Want to come?" Steve hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. I'd like that." Carlos grinned. "Good. Maybe you'll learn something over a cup of coffee, too." For the first time in a long while, Steve felt the faint stirrings of hope. That evening, Steve found himself sitting at a small cafe a few blocks from the supermarket. The atmosphere was warm, filled with the hum of quiet conversations and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee. Carlos sat across from him, along with two other employees, Maya, a cashier known for her quick wit, and Jordan, a stock clerk who always had a kind word for everyone. Steve felt out of place, unsure of how to act around people he had once regarded as beneath him. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, listening as the others chatted about their day. "You should have seen the mess in the freezer section this morning," Maya said, rolling her eyes. "Someone thought it was a good idea to stack ice cream tubs like Jenga blocks. Guess who had to clean it up?" "Classic," Jordan said with a chuckle. "They never learn." Carlos leaned back in his chair, his gaze settling on Steve. "What about you, Steve? First day on the job, how'd it go?" Steve hesitated, feeling the weight of their expectations. He cleared his throat. "It was different. A lot to get used to." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Different, huh? You mean like having to actually work for a change?" Jordan elbowed her playfully. "Come on, Maya. Give the guy a break." Steve managed a small smile. "She's not wrong," he admitted. "I spent so much time focusing on the big picture that I forgot what it's like to actually be on the ground, doing the work that keeps everything running." Carlos nodded approvingly. "That's a good realization. But now comes the hard part, earning back the trust of the people you've been ignoring." The table grew quiet for a moment. Steve looked down at his coffee, feeling the weight of Carlos's words. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt genuinely motivated to try. Over the next few weeks, Steve began to settle into his new role. He worked tirelessly, cleaning spills, stocking shelves, and assisting customers with a politeness that surprised even himself. At first, the employees were skeptical. Many avoided him, their past interactions with him leaving a sour taste. But slowly, as they saw his consistent effort, some began to warm up. One afternoon, while restocking cans in the soup aisle, Steve noticed a young mother struggling to calm her crying toddler while reaching for an item on a high shelf. Without hesitation, he stepped in. "Here, let me help you with that," he said, grabbing the can and handing it to her. The woman looked surprised but grateful. "Thank you. It's been one of those days." Steve smiled. I get it. Happens to the best of us. As he walked away, he caught sight of Carlos watching from a distance. The older man gave him a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement of progress. Ellen continued to visit the store occasionally, her presence subtle but meaningful. Each time she saw Steve, she noticed small changes, a softer tone in his voice, a willingness to listen, a genuine smile that hadn't been there before. One day, she approached him as he was helping an elderly man load groceries into his cart. "Steve," she said, her tone warm. He turned to her, wiping his hands on his apron. "Mrs. Lawrence. Good to see you." "I've been watching," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You're doing well." Steve felt a rush of pride but quickly tempered it. "I still have a lot to make up for." Ellen nodded. "True. But redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about proving you've learned from it." Her words stayed with him long after she left the store. By the end of the month, Robert returned for a routine check-in. As he walked through the store, he noticed the atmosphere had changed. Employees greeted each other warmly, customers seemed more at ease, and the tension that had once defined the environment was gone. In the break room, Robert found Steve sitting with Carlos and Jordan, laughing over something Maya had said. "Steve," Robert called, his tone measured. Steve stood immediately, his posture tense. "Mr. Lawrence." Robert gestured for him to follow. They walked to Robert's office, where he turned to face Steve. "I've been hearing things," Robert said. "Good things. Employees are talking about how you've been putting in the work, earning their respect." Steve nodded, his throat tightening. "I'm trying, sir." Robert studied him for a moment, then offered a rare smile. "Keep it up. You're not back to where you were yet, but you're on the right track. Don't waste this opportunity." Steve felt a surge of determination. "I won't. Thank you." As he left the office, Steve couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious hope. For the first time in years, he wasn't focused on climbing the corporate ladder. He was focused on becoming a better person. The next morning, Steve arrived at the store feeling a sense of purpose that had eluded him for years. He began his shift as usual, cleaning the floors before customers arrived. The work was routine, but for the first time, he found a strange satisfaction in it, a sense of contributing, however small, to the larger whole. As he pushed the mop down the frozen foods aisle, Ellen walked into the store. She was carrying a small tin of cookies wrapped in a red ribbon. Spotting Steve, she made her way over, her pace unhurried but purposeful. "Good morning, Steve," she said warmly. Steve stopped, leaning the mop against a nearby shelf. "Mrs. Lawrence," he said with a smile. "What brings you in so early?" She held out the tin. "A little thank you. I've been hearing good things about you, and I thought you might like a treat." Steve hesitated, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Ellen replied. "You've earned it. Besides, everyone deserves a little sweetness now and then." Steve took the tin, feeling an unexpected lump in his throat. "Thank you," he said softly. Ellen gave him a knowing smile. "Keep going, Steve. The road to change is long, but every step counts." Later that day, a new challenge presented itself. A particularly demanding customer stormed into the store, loudly complaining about a delay in a special order. She headed straight for the customer service desk, where Maya was working. "This is unacceptable," the woman shouted, her voice carrying across the store. "I've been waiting for over a week, and no one bothered to call me. What kind of operation is this?" Maya, flustered but professional, tried to explain the situation, but the woman wouldn't listen. Steve, hearing the commotion, approached cautiously. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Let's figure this out together." The woman turned to him, her expression sharp. "And who are you?" "Just someone who wants to help," Steve replied. "Why don't we step over here so we can sort this out?" Reluctantly, the woman followed him to a quieter corner. Steve listened as she vented her frustrations, nodding attentively. Once she had finished, he explained the mix-up and assured her that the order would be expedited. By the time their conversation ended, the woman's demeanor had softened. "Thank you," she said, her tone grudging but genuine. "I appreciate you taking the time." As she left, Maya approached Steve, her expression a mix of surprise and admiration. "Not bad," she said. "I wasn't sure you had that in you." Steve chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "Neither was I." In the break room later that afternoon, the employees gathered for a quick meeting. Carlos, ever the unofficial leader of the group, addressed the team. "I just want to take a moment to acknowledge something," he began. "We've had a lot of changes around here lately, and not all of them were easy. But I think we can all agree that things are getting better." He glanced at Steve, a faint smile on his lips. Steve's been pulling his weight, and more than that, he's been setting an example. It's not easy to admit when you've been wrong, let alone to change. So, here's to progress. The room filled with light applause, and Steve, caught off guard, felt a flush rise to his cheeks. "Thanks," he said awkwardly. "But, honestly, I've still got a lot to make up for." Maya grinned. "Yeah, but you're getting there. Baby steps, right?" "Right," Steve said with a smile, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. That evening, as Steve left the store, he saw Ellen sitting on a bench near the parking lot, gazing at the sunset. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat beside her. "Long day?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. "You could say that," Steve replied. Ellen nodded. "Change is exhausting, isn't it?" Steve looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "It is. But, it feels worth it." Ellen smiled. "That's how you know you're on the right path." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sky shift to shades of orange and pink. For the first time, Steve felt at peace, not because he had reached the end of his journey, but because he was finally moving in the right direction. The next morning, Steve arrived at Fresh Path with a renewed sense of purpose. The rhythm of his new life was settling in, but today felt different. There was a quiet hum of anticipation in the air, as if something important was about to happen. As he stepped into the store, he noticed Ellen speaking with Robert near the checkout lanes. They both looked up as he entered. Ellen offered her usual warm smile, while Robert gave a slight nod. "Steve," Robert called, motioning him over. Steve approached, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Good morning, Mr. Lawrence." "Mrs. Lawrence." Robert's expression was unreadable. "We've been discussing the upcoming community outreach event," he said. "It's an annual tradition here, though I suspect you've never been involved in it before." Steve shook his head. "No, I haven't." This year, Ellen chimed in, her voice gentle but firm, "We'd like you to take the lead." Steve blinked, stunned. "Me? Are you sure?" Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's an opportunity to prove what you've learned. Organizing this event will require coordination, leadership, and, most importantly, listening to others." Ellen placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I believe you can do it." Steve hesitated, feeling the weight of the responsibility. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do my best." Over the next few days, Steve dove headfirst into planning the event. The goal was to provide a day of free groceries, health checkups, and family activities for underserved members of the community. It was a tradition that had started in the early days of Fresh Path, one Ellen had championed personally. Steve began by meeting with the staff. They gathered in the break room, where he laid out his ideas on a whiteboard. "Okay," he said, his voice steady but nervous. "Here's what we're working with. I'll need volunteers for logistics, event setup, and customer service. I also want input on how we can make this better than last year." At first, the room was quiet. Steve glanced around, feeling the old tension creeping back. But then Carlos spoke up. "I think we should include a job fair," he said. "There are a lot of folks in the neighborhood who could use the opportunity." "That's a great idea," Steve replied, writing it down. "What else?" Maya raised her hand, smirking. "How about a raffle? People love free stuff." "Done," Steve said, adding it to the list. Slowly, more ideas flowed in. Steve listened carefully, nodding and incorporating as much feedback as he could. By the end of the meeting, the energy in the room had shifted. As the event day approached, the entire store buzzed with preparation. Steve worked alongside the staff, hauling boxes of supplies, setting up tables, and coordinating with local organizations. On the morning of the event, Steve stood in the parking lot, surveying the scene. Tents were set up, volunteers were bustling around, and families were already lining up. Ellen approached him, her eyes shining with pride. "You've done well, Steve," she said. "Thanks," he replied, though his voice was thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without everyone's help." Ellen smiled. "That's the point, isn't it? Leadership isn't about doing everything yourself. It's about bringing people together." As the event unfolded, Steve found himself in the thick of it, greeting families, solving last-minute problems, and making sure everything ran smoothly. He noticed a young boy struggling to carry a bag of groceries and rushed over to help. "Here, let me give you a hand," Steve said, lifting the bag and walking the boy to his mother. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "This means so much to us." Steve nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. By the end of the day, the parking lot was filled with laughter and conversation. The event had been a resounding success. As the last families left, the staff gathered to celebrate. Carlos clapped Steve on the back. "You did good today, boss." Steve chuckled. "I'm not the boss anymore, remember?" "Maybe not," Carlos said, grinning. "But you're earning your place back, one step at a time." As the sun set, Steve stood with Ellen and Robert, watching the volunteers pack up. "You've come a long way, Steve," Robert said, his tone sincere. "Keep it up." Ellen nodded, her smile soft and approving. "I think today showed everyone, including yourself, what you're capable of." For the first time, Steve felt a sense of pride, not in his position or accomplishments, but in the connections he was rebuilding. The following week, the atmosphere at Fresh Path was noticeably lighter. Employees seemed more engaged, and customers were commenting on how the store felt friendlier. Steve, now fully immersed in his new role, began to notice the small things that made a big difference, helping someone find an item, stepping in to cover a shift, or simply offering a genuine smile. One afternoon, as Steve was stocking shelves, Ellen entered the store with a clipboard in hand. She was conducting one of her routine inspections, something she had done quietly for years to ensure the store upheld its founding principles. She approached Steve, watching as he carefully arranged cans of soup. "You've gotten good at that," Ellen said with a warm smile. Steve chuckled, glancing at her. "It's all about symmetry, right? Gotta keep the customers happy." Ellen nodded, but her expression turned thoughtful. "There's something I want to talk to you about. Do you have a minute?" Steve set the last can in place and turned to face her. "Of course." They walked to the small cafe area near the store entrance, where Ellen took a seat across from him. "I've been thinking a lot about the event last week," she began. "It was a success, and that's thanks in large part to you. But there's something more I want to address." Steve tilted his head, unsure of where this was going. "You've come a long way," Ellen continued. "But I know it hasn't been easy. Change never is. And yet, you've managed to earn back the respect of your team and even some of the customers. That says a lot about your character." Steve shifted uncomfortably, not used to receiving praise. "I'm just trying to make up for my mistakes," he said quietly. Ellen reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "And you're doing that. But I also want you to understand that redemption isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about building something better for the future." Steve looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "What do you mean?" "I think you have the potential to be a leader again," Ellen said. "Not the kind of leader you were before, focused on power and position, but the kind of leader who inspires others and upholds the values this store was built on." Steve felt a lump form in his throat. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Ellen smiled gently. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, listening, and doing your best to make a difference." The next few days passed in a blur of work and reflection. Steve couldn't stop thinking about Ellen's words. He had spent so long focused on undoing the damage he had caused that he hadn't considered what might come next. One evening, as he was locking up the store, Robert appeared at the door. "Got a minute?" Robert asked. Steve nodded, letting him in. They walked through the quiet aisles, the shelves neatly stocked and the floors freshly cleaned. "I heard about your conversation with my mom," Robert said, breaking the silence. Steve's stomach tightened. "She mentioned leadership," he admitted. "But I don't know if I'm the right person for that." Robert stopped, turning to face him. "Do you know why my mom believes in you?" Steve shook his head. "She sees something that most people overlook. You've made mistakes, sure, but you've also proven that you're willing to learn and grow. That's rare, Steve. And that's exactly what makes you the right person to lead." Steve looked down, the words sinking in. "What if I screw it up again?" "You will," Robert said with a small smile. "Everyone does. The difference now is that you'll own it, learn from it, and do better. That's what matters." That night, Steve sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He thought about the journey he had been on, the mistakes, the lessons, the small victories. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that he could be more than the person he had been. The next morning, as he walked into the store, Steve felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was ready to face it. And this time, he knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. The following week brought unexpected challenges to Fresh Path. A severe storm had swept through the area, leaving many residents without power and struggling to access essentials. The supermarket, equipped with backup generators, became a vital resource for the community. Steve arrived early one morning to find a line of customers already forming outside. Their faces reflected worry and exhaustion. Inside, employees were scrambling to restock shelves, handle deliveries, and prepare for what was sure to be a chaotic day. Steve immediately took charge, rallying the team. "Okay, listen up," he said, standing in the middle of the break room as employees gathered. "Today's going to be tough, but we've got a chance to really help people. That's what matters. Let's make sure everyone feels welcome and taken care of." Maya raised her hand. "We're already running low on bottled water. What do we do if we run out?" Steve thought for a moment. "We'll set up a station to refill jugs and reusable bottles." "Carlos, can you take care of that?" Carlos nodded. "On it." Jordan chimed in. "What about people who can't afford groceries right now? We've seen a lot of that lately." Steve looked around the room, feeling the weight of their concerns. "We'll work something out. For now, let's focus on making this place as organized and efficient as possible. If anyone has ideas or runs into problems, come find me." The team dispersed, and Steve rolled up his sleeves, diving into the chaos. Throughout the day, Steve worked tirelessly alongside the employees. He unloaded crates from delivery trucks, helped customers find supplies, and personally ensured that the refill station for water was running smoothly. At one point, he noticed a woman with two small children struggling to count change at the checkout counter. "Don't worry about it," Steve said, stepping forward. He handed the cashier a store voucher from his pocket to cover the cost. The woman looked at him, tears in her eyes. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done." "It's what we're here for," Steve replied, offering a reassuring smile. As the hours passed, the store became a hub of activity. Customers were not just shopping but connecting, sharing stories, offering help, and even volunteering to assist the staff. Ellen arrived mid-afternoon, taking in the scene with quiet pride. She spotted Steve in the dairy aisle, restocking cartons of milk. "You're in your element today," she said, approaching him. Steve wiped his brow and laughed. "I don't know about that, but it feels good to be useful." Ellen nodded. "It's more than that. Look around." Steve followed her gaze. Employees were working seamlessly together, customers were expressing gratitude, and the atmosphere, despite the storm's aftermath, was one of hope and resilience. "This is what Fresh Path was meant to be," Ellen said. "A place where people come together when it matters most." Steve felt a swell of emotion. For so long, he had seen the store as just a business, a stepping stone in his career. Now, he understood its deeper purpose. By the end of the day, the shelves were nearly empty, and the employees were exhausted but content. As Steve locked up, Carlos walked over and clapped him on the back. "Hey, boss," Carlos said, grinning. "You did good today." The old Steve wouldn't have made it past lunchtime. Steve laughed, though the compliment struck a chord. "Thanks, Carlos. But it wasn't just me. Everyone stepped up." "That's what a good leader does," Carlos replied. "Brings out the best in everyone." That night, Steve sat in his small apartment, reflecting on the day. The storm had tested him and the team, but it had also shown him how far he had come. Ellen's words echoed in his mind: redemption isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about building something better for the future. For the first time, Steve felt like he was doing just that. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been a part of his journey. The morning after the storm, the sun finally broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting a warm light over Fresh Path. Steve arrived earlier than usual, to assess the store's condition. Despite the chaos of the previous day, everything had gone smoothly, and the shelves were now being restocked to prepare for another influx of customers. As Steve entered, the air felt different, lighter, hopeful. He walked the aisles, nodding to employees who were busy with their morning tasks. Maya was organizing the checkout counters, while Carlos was already unloading the first delivery truck of the day. "Morning, boss," Carlos called, tossing a small box to Steve. "Thought you might want to keep those shelves stocked." Steve caught the box, laughing. "You'll have me hauling crates for the rest of my life if you keep this up." Carlos smirked. "Keeps you humble." By mid-morning, customers were filing in steadily. Steve found himself assisting a young couple who were shopping for baby supplies. They looked overwhelmed, flipping through a long list. "Need a hand?" Steve asked, approaching them. The woman looked up, relief evident in her eyes. "Yes, thank you. We're expecting our first, and we have no idea what we're doing." Steve smiled, guiding them through the aisles and offering practical advice. By the time they checked out, they looked less anxious and more excited. "Congratulations," Steve said as they left. "You're going to do great." Around noon, Ellen arrived for another quiet visit. She greeted employees warmly, checking in with each one. When she found Steve helping a customer compare canned goods, she waited patiently until he finished. "You seem at home," Ellen said when he turned to her. Steve shrugged modestly. "It's starting to feel that way." "Good," Ellen replied. "Because there's something I want to discuss with you." She gestured toward the break room, and Steve followed her. Once inside, Ellen took a seat at the small table, motioning for Steve to join her. "I've been thinking about the future," Ellen began, her tone serious but kind. "And about what this store needs moving forward." Steve nodded, unsure of where she was headed. "You've proven yourself, Steve," Ellen said. "Not just to me, but to the entire team. You've taken responsibility for your mistakes, and more than that, you've worked to make things right. That's what leadership is about." Steve looked at her, his heart pounding. "What are you saying?" Ellen smiled. "I'm saying it's time for you to take on more responsibility. Robert and I agree, you're ready to step into a management role again. Not as the person you were before, but as the leader you've become." The weight of her words settled over Steve like a blanket. He felt equal parts exhilarated and terrified. I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "You are," Ellen said firmly. "But this time, you won't be doing it alone. The team is behind you, and so are we." Steve took a deep breath, his mind racing. He thought of the long journey that had brought him to this moment, the mistakes, the lessons, the people who had believed in him even when he hadn't believed in himself. Finally, he met Ellen's gaze. "If you believe in me, then I'll do it. I won't let you down." Ellen's smile widened. "I know you won't." By the end of the day, word had spread among the employees about Steve's new role. Maya was the first to approach him, a mischievous grin on her face. "So, back in charge, huh?" she teased. "Guess this means I have to take you seriously now." Steve laughed, shaking his head. "I wouldn't count on that." Carlos joined them, clapping Steve on the shoulder. "Congrats, boss. Just don't forget the little guys when you're making all the big decisions." "Never," Steve said, his voice steady. "We're all in this together." That night, as Steve closed up the store, he stood for a moment at the entrance, looking out at the darkened parking lot. The journey had been long and full of challenges, but he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He wasn't the same man who had started this job, and for that, he was grateful. Turning off the lights, he locked the door and walked to his car, ready to face the next chapter with the people who had taught him the true meaning of leadership and community. The next day marked Steve's first official shift as Freshpath's new assistant manager. As he walked through the store in his updated uniform, the title embroidered neatly on his name tag, he felt both pride and an undercurrent of nervousness. This time, the title wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a responsibility to the people who had stood by him, even when he hadn't deserved it. He started his morning by checking in with the team. Maya was managing the registers, Carlos was handling inventory, and Jordan was assisting a new hire, a young man named Ethan who seemed both eager and overwhelmed. Steve made his rounds, offering encouragement where needed and making mental notes of things to improve. "Ethan," Steve said as he approached the new hire in the stockroom. "How's your first week going?" Ethan glanced up from the box he was unpacking, his face a mix of nerves and determination. "It's good, just a lot to take in." Steve smiled. "I know the feeling. Let me give you a tip, focus on one task at a time. It's easy to get overwhelmed if you try to do everything all at once." Ethan nodded, visibly relaxing. "Thanks, Mr. Steve." "Just Steve," he corrected, patting Ethan on the shoulder. "You're doing great." Later that morning, Steve called a meeting in the break room. The employees filed in, curious about the purpose of the gathering. Once everyone was seated, Steve stood at the front, holding a clipboard. "First of all, I want to thank you all for the support you've shown me over the past few months," Steve began, his voice steady but sincere. "This isn't just a team, it's a family. And I want to make sure that everyone here feels valued and heard." There were murmurs of agreement around the room. "With that in mind, I've been working on a few ideas to improve how we operate. But I don't want this to be a one-sided conversation. If you have suggestions or concerns, I want to hear them." Maya raised her hand first. Can we talk about the scheduling system? It's been a mess lately, and some of us have had to switch shifts at the last minute. Steve nodded, making a note on his clipboard. Got it. I'll review the schedule and see where we can make adjustments. Anything else? Carlos spoke up next. We've been running low on some items faster than usual. Maybe we could get ahead of it by ordering more during peak times. Great point, Steve said. I'll work with inventory to make sure we're stocked appropriately. As the discussion continued, more employees chimed in, and Steve took detailed notes. By the end of the meeting, the team left feeling heard and appreciated, a buzz of optimism filling the air. That afternoon, Ellen stopped by the store, as she often did. She found Steve in the produce section, carefully inspecting a shipment of fresh vegetables. Steve, she said warmly, how's the first day going? Steve straightened, smiling. So far, so good. The team's been great, and we're tackling a few issues that came up during the meeting. Ellen's eyes sparkled with pride. I'm not surprised. You've come a long way. Steve hesitated, then said, it's because of you. You and the team believed in me when I didn't deserve it. I won't forget that. Ellen reached out, squeezing his arm. You've earned this, Steve. Remember, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up and doing your best for the people who rely on you. As the day wound down, Steve reflected on how far he had come. Months ago, he had been consumed by ambition, blind to the needs of others. Now, he was part of something bigger, a community built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. That evening, as he locked up the store, he paused to look back through the glass doors. The lights were off, but he could still see the shelves neatly stocked, the registers ready for the next day, and the faint outlines of a place that had become more than just a job. It was a second chance, and this time, Steve was determined to make it count. The following week, FreshPath faced an unexpected challenge that tested everything Steve had been working toward. A routine health inspection was scheduled, but a miscommunication with the cleaning crew meant several critical areas of the store hadn't been properly prepared. Steve discovered the oversight early in the morning as he reviewed the checklist in his office. His heart sank when he realized the extent of the problem. If the inspection didn't go well, it could lead to fines, or worse, temporary closure. He immediately called an emergency team meeting. Okay, everyone, Steve said, standing at the front of the break room, his clipboard in hand. We've got a situation. The health inspector will be here in 4 hours, and some key areas aren't up to standard. We need all hands on deck to fix this, and we need to move fast. The employees exchanged nervous glances. Carlos broke the silence. What exactly are we dealing with? Steve outlined the problem. The storage room needed organizing, the deli counters required deep cleaning, and the refrigerated units in the back had to be sanitized. Carlos, Steve said, can you and Jordan handle the storage room? Maya, I'll need you and Ethan to take the deli counters. I'll focus on the refrigerators. We're going to have to push hard, but I know we can get this done. Maya raised an eyebrow. And what about the customers? It's a busy day, who's going to cover the floor? Steve hesitated, then said, I'll rotate between tasks and the floor as much as I can. If anyone's free, jump in to help with customers when needed. Communication is key, let's stay on the same page. The team sprang into action. The storage room buzzed with activity as Carlos and Jordan worked quickly to reorganize pallets and clear clutter. You know, Carlos said, stacking boxes with practiced efficiency, this kind of thing would have driven you up the wall a few months ago. Steve poked his head in, a damp rag in hand from scrubbing refrigerators. You're not wrong, he said, grinning. But that was before I figured out what really matters. Carlos laughed. Good to know you've seen the light. In the deli section, Maya led Ethan through a crash course in deep cleaning. Scrub every surface like your life depends on it, Maya said, her tone half serious. And don't miss the corners, they always check the corners. Ethan nodded, his movements clumsy but earnest. Across the store, Steve was scrubbing the inside of the walk-in refrigerator, his shirt damp with sweat. The task was grueling, but he didn't complain. He had learned that leadership wasn't about delegating the hard work, it was about stepping up when it mattered most. As the clock ticked closer to the inspection time, the team began to pull everything together. Ellen arrived just as the finishing touches were being applied. "Steve," she called, spotting him wiping down a counter. He turned, looking both exhausted and determined. "Ellen, I didn't expect you to be here." She smiled knowingly. "I heard about the inspection and thought I'd lend some moral support." Steve shook his head with a small laugh. "Moral support is appreciated, but I think we're about as ready as we'll ever be." Ellen placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've got this. I can tell." When the health inspector arrived, the tension in the store was palpable. Steve greeted her professionally, walking her through each section of the store as she conducted her evaluation. The inspector's expression remained neutral, her clipboard filling with notes as she checked the deli, the storage room, and the refrigerators. Steve stayed close, answering questions and providing explanations when necessary. After what felt like an eternity, the inspector finished her rounds. "Well," she said, looking at Steve, "I have to say, you've done an excellent job. Everything is in compliance. Keep up the good work." Relief flooded Steve as he shook her hand. "Thank you. We'll make sure to maintain these standards." When the inspector left, the store erupted in cheers. The team gathered in the break room, their faces flushed with triumph. Steve stood at the front, raising his hands to quiet the room. "I just want to say how proud I am of all of you," he began. "Today was a tough one, but you showed what this team is made of. This wasn't just about passing an inspection, it was about proving to ourselves that we can handle anything." Carlos raised a cup of soda. "To Fresh Path." "To Fresh Path," the team echoed, their voices filled with pride. That night, as Steve locked up, Ellen was waiting outside. "You handled that beautifully," she said, falling into step beside him. Steve smiled. "I couldn't have done it without the team. They were incredible today." Ellen nodded. "And they were following your lead. Remember that." As they walked toward the parking lot, Steve felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He had faced yet another challenge and come out stronger, not just as a leader, but as a part of the Fresh Path family. The following days brought a sense of calm to Fresh Path. With the health inspection behind them and the store running smoothly, Steve finally felt he could breathe. But just as he was settling into his rhythm, a call from Robert jolted him into action. "Steve, we've got a situation," Robert said, his voice tense. "There's a corporate meeting this Friday, and they're reviewing the performance of all stores. Fresh Path has been under scrutiny since before you turn things around. I need you to prepare a presentation showing what's changed." Steve gripped the phone tightly. "What exactly are they looking for?" "They want numbers, of course," Robert replied. "But more than that, they want to see how the store has improved in terms of morale, community impact, and leadership. You've done the work, now it's time to show it off." For the next few days, Steve poured himself into the presentation. He stayed late each night, compiling data on sales improvements, customer satisfaction scores, and employee retention rates. But he didn't stop there. He also gathered testimonials from employees and customers, stories that highlighted how Fresh Path had become more than just a grocery store, it was a pillar of the community. Maya helped by organizing feedback from customers. "People love what we've done since the storm," she said, handing Steve a stack of notes. "They're talking about how the store feels welcoming again." Carlos worked on gathering before and after comparisons of inventory efficiency, while Jordan created charts that showed how team productivity had increased. "You've got this, Steve," Carlos said one evening as they packed up. "Just tell the truth. The work speaks for itself." When Friday arrived, Steve drove to the corporate office feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. The boardroom was large and imposing, filled with executives in sharp suits. Robert sat at one end of the table, giving Steve an encouraging nod as he entered. Steve took a deep breath and began his presentation. He started with the numbers, outlining how sales had steadily increased over the past few months, particularly after the community outreach event. He showed graphs of customer satisfaction surveys, highlighting phrases like friendly staff, clean store, and a place I can rely on. But it was when he moved on to the personal stories that the room grew quiet. "This is Margaret," Steve said, clicking to a photo of an elderly woman with a shopping cart. "She lives alone and struggled to get groceries during the storm. Our team delivered food to her home when she couldn't make it here." He clicked to another slide. "This is Ethan, one of our newest employees. He came to us unsure of himself, but thanks to the support of the team, he's thriving." Steve paused, looking around the room. FreshPath isn't just a store. It's a part of the community. And what we've accomplished wouldn't have been possible without the people who work there and the customers who trust us. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before the room broke into applause. After the meeting, Robert approached Steve with a wide grin. "They loved it," he said, clapping Steve on the back. "You not only convinced them to keep FreshPath on their radar, you made them see its value in a whole new way." Steve exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. "I couldn't have done it without the team." Robert nodded. "And that's what makes you the leader you've become. You've learned that it's never just about you." When Steve returned to the store later that afternoon, the team was waiting for him. Maya had strung up a banner that read, "Welcome back, boss," and Carlos held a tray of cupcakes. "How'd it go?" Maya asked, leaning on the counter with a grin. Steve smiled. "We nailed it. The board sees what we've built here, and they're behind us." The team cheered, and Steve looked around at the people who had become more than co-workers, they were family. That night, as Steve locked up the store, he stood for a moment in the quiet parking lot. He thought about how far he'd come, from an arrogant manager to someone who understood the value of connection, trust, and hard work. FreshPath had changed him, just as much as he had helped change it. And for the first time in a long time, Steve felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The momentum from the corporate meeting carried into the next week, and the entire team at FreshPath felt the buzz of success. The renewed energy wasn't just evident in the way they worked, it was visible in the way they interacted. Employees joked more freely, customers lingered to chat, and Steve felt an undeniable pride in the sense of community they had built together. One afternoon, as Steve was walking through the produce section, Ellen arrived, her usual calm presence instantly grounding him. "Steve," she said, smiling as she approached. "I've been hearing nothing but good things. Robert called me last night to tell me about the meeting. He said you were remarkable." Steve chuckled, feeling a little shy under her praise. "It wasn't just me, Ellen. The team gave me the stories and data I needed. I just presented it." "That's the humility I was hoping to see," Ellen said, her eyes twinkling. "But don't downplay your role. A leader who listens and gives credit is rare." Ellen paused, glancing around the bustling store. "Have you thought about what's next for you?" Steve hesitated. The question lingered in his mind often these days, but he hadn't dared to voice it. "I don't know," he admitted. "I feel like I've finally found my place here. For the first time, I'm not looking for the next step, I'm just content." Ellen's smile softened. "Contentment is a gift. But don't confuse it with stagnation. When the time comes, you'll know what your next step should be. Just promise me you'll keep growing." Steve nodded. "I promise." That evening, Steve stayed late to help Ethan with some additional training. The young employee was learning how to handle inventory, and while he was improving, his nervousness occasionally got the better of him. "Ethan," Steve said gently as the younger man fumbled with the scanner, "it's okay to make mistakes. That's how you learn. The important thing is to ask for help when you need it." Ethan looked up, his brow furrowed. "Did you ever feel like you didn't know what you were doing when you started?" Steve chuckled, leaning against the shelf. "All the time. And honestly, I still feel that way sometimes. But I've learned that it's okay not to have all the answers. What matters is how you handle it." Ethan nodded, his confidence returning. "Thanks, Steve. That helps." The next morning, Steve walked into the store to find a letter waiting for him on his desk. The envelope bore the corporate logo, and his name was written in clean, precise script. He opened it slowly, reading the contents carefully. It was a commendation from the board, congratulating him on his leadership and the transformation of Fresh Path. Attached to the letter was an invitation to attend a regional leadership summit, where he would have the opportunity to share his experiences with other managers and learn from some of the best in the company. Steve sat back in his chair, the letter resting in his hands. He felt a mix of emotions, honor, excitement, and a touch of anxiety. This was a chance to grow, just as Ellen had encouraged him to do. Later that day, during the team meeting, Steve shared the news with the staff. "They want me to speak at a leadership summit," he said, holding up the letter. "It's a chance to represent everything we've accomplished here at Fresh Path." The room erupted in applause. Maya was the first to speak. "That's amazing, Steve. You're going to crush it." Carlos grinned. "Just don't forget where you came from when you're rubbing elbows with the big shots." Steve laughed, his gratitude evident. "Trust me, I couldn't forget this place if I tried. Everything I learned here, from all of you." That evening, as the sun set over the parking lot, Steve stood by the entrance of the store, reflecting on how far he had come. The journey wasn't just about redemption, it was about discovering what truly mattered, the people, the community, and the shared vision they had built together. The path ahead felt wide open, and for the first time, Steve was ready to take it, step by step, with the lessons of Fresh Path guiding him forward. The weeks leading up to the leadership summit were a whirlwind for Steve. While he continued his day-to-day responsibilities at Fresh Path, he also spent his evenings preparing his presentation. He wanted to ensure that he represented not only himself but also the team and the community that had shaped his journey. One night, as he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by notes, slides, and customer testimonials, he received a call from Ellen. "How's the preparation going?" she asked, her voice warm and steady. "Honestly, it's overwhelming," Steve admitted. "I've written 3 drafts of my speech, and none of them feel right. I want to tell our story, but I also want to show that what we've built here can be a model for others." Ellen was quiet for a moment before replying. "Steve, the best stories aren't just about success, they're about the struggles and lessons along the way. Be honest about where you started and how you've grown. That's what people will connect with." Her words resonated deeply. "Thanks, Ellen," Steve said. "I needed that." "You'll do great," she said confidently. "You've already proven that." On the day of the summit, Steve arrived at the corporate headquarters dressed in a sharp but simple suit. The atmosphere was buzzing with energy as managers from across the region mingled and exchanged ideas. As Steve stepped into the conference hall, he felt a wave of nerves. The room was packed with professionals, each carrying their own experiences and expectations. Robert met him at the entrance, offering a reassuring pat on the back. "Relax," Robert said with a grin. "You've got this. Just tell them the truth." When it was Steve's turn to speak, he took the stage with a deep breath. The lights were bright, and the room was silent, every face turned toward him. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but earnest. "I'm Steve, the assistant manager at Fresh Path, a neighborhood store that, not too long ago, was struggling to find its way, much like I was." He paused, letting the words sink in. "About a year ago, I was a different person. I was focused on results, titles, and climbing the corporate ladder. I didn't see the people around me as teammates or the customers as part of a community. And because of that, I made mistakes, big ones. Steve went on to share the story of his journey, from the moment Ellen had entered the store to his demotion, the lessons he learned, and the way the team had worked together to rebuild Fresh Path. I thought leadership was about control and authority, he said. But I've learned that real leadership is about trust, empathy, and showing up for the people who depend on you. He shared stories of the employees, how Maya's ideas had transformed the checkout process, how Carlos had become a pillar of consistency, and how Ethan, the newest hire, had grown into a confident team member. He talked about the customers, the community events, and the day they rallied during the storm to keep the store running. Fresh Path taught me that a store isn't just a place where people shop. It's a place where they connect, where they feel valued, and where they find support when they need it most. And that's what we, as leaders, should strive to create. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Steve felt a rush of emotion, gratitude, pride, and the sense that he had finally found his voice. After the presentation, attendees approached him with questions and words of encouragement. A few managers asked for advice on implementing similar changes in their own stores. One senior executive pulled Steve aside. "That was one of the most authentic and inspiring talks I've heard in years," she said. "We need more leaders like you in this company." That evening, as Steve returned to Fresh Path, the team was waiting for him with a small celebration. Maya had baked a cake, and Carlos had set up a banner that read, "Our leader, our inspiration." "You're all too much," Steve said, laughing as they cheered. "You earned it," Maya said, handing him a slice of cake. As the team gathered around, Steve looked at each of them, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was a family, a purpose, and a second chance that had transformed him in ways he never could have imagined. That night, as he locked up the store and stood alone in the parking lot, Steve reflected on how far he'd come. The summit had been a milestone, but it wasn't the end. It was another step forward, and he was ready for whatever came next. The weeks after the summit brought a renewed sense of purpose to Steve and the Fresh Path team. The energy from the event didn't just linger, it grew, fueling new ideas and initiatives. Inspired by the feedback he had received, Steve decided it was time to take the next step in strengthening the store's connection to the community. One morning, as the staff gathered for their usual meeting, Steve stood at the front of the break room with a clipboard and a determined expression. "All right, everyone," he began, "we've been doing amazing work here, but I think we can do even more. Fresh Path has always been a community hub, but what if we became a true partner to the people around us?" Maya raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you thinking, Steve?" Steve grinned. "I want us to launch a community outreach program, something ongoing, not just a one-time event. We could partner with local schools, food banks, and small businesses. We have resources, space, and most importantly, people who care. Let's use them to make a real impact." The room buzzed with excitement as the team exchanged ideas. "We could host job training workshops," Carlos suggested. "Help people build skills that'll last. And maybe a cooking class or two," Maya added. "There are a lot of families who'd love to learn how to make healthy meals on a budget." Steve nodded, jotting down their suggestions. "Exactly. This isn't just about what we can give, it's about building relationships and empowering others. Let's start small and grow from there." Over the next few weeks, the team worked tirelessly to bring the program to life. The break room became a makeshift planning center, with charts, schedules, and flyers covering every available surface. Ellen even joined in, offering her wisdom and experience to guide the efforts. One of the first initiatives was a partnership with a nearby elementary school. Fresh Path sponsored a weekend event called Family Food Fun, where kids and parents learned about nutrition and cooked simple meals together. On the day of the event, Steve stood in the store's community space, watching as families filled the room. Tables were set up with fresh ingredients, and volunteers guided kids through the process of making their own mini pizzas. The laughter and energy were infectious. As Steve helped a young boy grate cheese, the boy's mother approached him. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's been a tough year for us, and events like this remind me that there are people who care." Steve smiled, feeling a lump in his throat. "You're welcome. That's what this is all about." The success of Family Food Fun led to more ideas. Over the next month, Fresh Path hosted a job training session led by Carlos, a small business showcase where local entrepreneurs sold their products, and even a monthly senior discount day championed by Ellen. The store became a hub of activity, not just for shopping but for connection and growth. Customers began to see Fresh Path as more than just a place to buy groceries. It was a place where people could find support, learn, and feel valued. One evening, as the team wrapped up after another successful event, Ellen called Steve over. "Steve," she said, her tone warm but serious, "I've been watching all of this, and I couldn't be prouder. You've taken what we built years ago and elevated it to something even greater." Steve looked at her, humbled. "I couldn't have done it without the team, or without you. You've been my guiding light through all of this." Ellen smiled, a glimmer of emotion in her eyes. "That's kind of you to say, but this was always in you, Steve. You just needed to find it." That night, as Steve locked up the store, he stood in the empty parking lot, taking in the quiet. The transformation of Fresh Path wasn't just about the programs or the numbers, it was about the lives they were touching and the sense of belonging they were creating. Steve knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time, he didn't feel the weight of the journey ahead. Instead, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment and a quiet confidence that, together, they could accomplish anything. As he walked to his car, the lights of the store glowed warmly behind him, a beacon of hope and community, and a testament to how far they had come. A few weeks later, Fresh Path received unexpected news that sent ripples of excitement and nervous energy through the team. The corporate office had chosen the store to pilot a new initiative called Community First, a program designed to replicate Fresh Path's success across the company's entire network of stores. Steve was both honored and apprehensive when Robert called to explain. "This is a big deal, Steve," Robert said over the phone. "The board wants to use Fresh Path as the model. They're sending observers to see how you operate, learn from the team, and document what makes this store work so well." Steve leaned back in his chair, processing the weight of the announcement. "When does it start?" "They'll be there in 2 weeks," Robert replied. "Just keep doing what you're doing. They're coming to see why Fresh Path stands out, not to find flaws." Steve exhaled. "Got it. We'll be ready." The next morning, Steve called the team together for a meeting. He explained the situation, watching their faces shift from surprise to determination. "So, they're sending people to spy on us?" Maya asked, half joking. "Not spies," Steve replied with a laugh. "Observers. They want to learn from what we've built here. This is our chance to show them what makes Fresh Path special." Carlos crossed his arms, grinning. "Well, I hope they're ready to work. They won't see the magic if they're just standing around with clipboards." The room chuckled, and Steve nodded. "Exactly. We're not going to do anything differently. Just keep being yourselves, because that's what got us here in the first place." As the 2-week countdown began, the team worked harder than ever to ensure everything was running smoothly. Steve spent hours reviewing processes, meeting with employees, and checking in with customers to ensure the store was in top shape. Ellen stopped by one afternoon and found Steve rearranging displays in the produce section. "Still working on perfection, I see," she teased. Steve straightened, smiling. "Just trying to make sure everything's ready." Ellen tilted her head, her expression softening. "Steve, they're coming to see what makes this place unique. And that's not the displays or the numbers. It's the people, You, the team, the customers. Don't lose sight of that. Her words lingered with Steve as he finished his tasks that day. When the day of the observation arrived, the corporate team entered the store early in the morning, their polished appearances contrasting sharply with the relaxed atmosphere of Fresh Path. Steve greeted them warmly, shaking hands and introducing himself. "We're excited to have you here," he said. "Feel free to look around and ask questions. Our team is happy to share what we do." The observers split into small groups, each shadowing different employees. One followed Maya at the registers, another joined Carlos in the stockroom, and a third observed Steve as he helped a customer find an item. Throughout the day, the team showcased not just their hard work but the genuine care and connection that had become FreshPath's hallmark. Carlos explained how he trained new hires with patience and humor, while Maya demonstrated her knack for turning even the busiest rush into a seamless operation. Steve took one of the observers to the community corner, where a group of local vendors was hosting a small market. "This is one of the things we're proudest of," Steve explained. "It's not just about selling products, it's about giving people a platform to succeed. When they succeed, the whole community benefits." The observer nodded, taking notes. "It's impressive. You've created something that feels bigger than just a store." By the end of the day, the corporate team gathered in the break room for a debrief. One of the observers, a senior executive named Linda, addressed the group. "I've been with this company for over 20 years, Linda began, "and I've never seen anything quite like this. The sense of community, the teamwork, the genuine care, it's inspiring. This isn't just a model we want to replicate. It's a culture we need to build across the company." The room erupted in applause, and Steve felt a wave of pride and relief. That evening, as the corporate team departed, Ellen stayed behind to talk to Steve. "You've done something extraordinary here," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Not just for Fresh Path, but for everyone who walks through those doors." Steve nodded, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "It's not just me, Ellen. It's all of us. This store, it's become something bigger than I ever imagined." Ellen smiled. "That's the beauty of it, Steve. When people come together with a shared purpose, there's no limit to what they can achieve." As Steve locked up the store that night, he stood for a moment, staring at the glowing Fresh Path sign. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had brought them to this moment, a place of hope, connection, and possibility. Steve knew there was still more to do, but for now, he allowed himself a rare moment of quiet pride. Together, they had built something that truly mattered, and he was ready to see where the path would lead next. In the weeks following the corporate team's visit, Fresh Path became a beacon of recognition across the company. News of the store's unique approach to leadership, community engagement, and teamwork spread quickly, sparking interest and even admiration from other stores in the region. Steve began receiving emails and calls from managers at other locations, each curious to learn how they could replicate Fresh Path's success. At first, it felt overwhelming, but Steve knew this was an opportunity to share what made their store special while continuing to grow himself. One such call came from Linda, the senior executive who had led the corporate visit. "Steve," Linda said, her tone warm and encouraging, "the board has been discussing Fresh Path's model, and we'd like you to help us roll out the Community First program to a few pilot stores. You'll work as a mentor, guiding their managers through the process." Steve paused, the weight of her words sinking in. "You want me to oversee other stores?" "Not exactly oversee," Linda clarified. "Think of it as consulting. You'll share what you've learned and help them build their own unique version of what you've created at Fresh Path. We believe in your leadership, Steve. You've proven you can inspire change." When Steve shared the news with the Fresh Path team, their reactions were a mix of excitement and concern. "So, you're leaving us?" Maya asked, crossing her arms. Steve shook his head quickly. "Not leaving. I'll still be based here, but I'll spend some time traveling to other stores. Fresh Path will always be my home. Carlos leaned back in his chair, smirking. Well, as long as you remember where you came from, I guess we'll allow it. The room filled with laughter, but Steve could see the genuine support in their faces. Over the next month, Steve visited 3 pilot stores, each in different stages of development. At the first store, he met with a manager named Claire, who was eager but struggling to connect with her team. During their first meeting, Claire confessed, "I don't know how to build the kind of culture you've described. My employees seem disconnected, and I'm not sure where to start." Steve thought for a moment before replying. "It starts with listening. Spend time on the floor, talk to your employees, and ask them what they need. Let them see that you care about their success." Over the next few days, Steve worked alongside Claire, demonstrating how to foster trust and open communication. By the end of his visit, the atmosphere in her store had already begun to shift. At the second store, the challenges were different. The community saw the store as cold and uninviting, a place where transactions happened but connections didn't. Steve met with the team and shared ideas for community engagement, much like Fresh Path's cooking classes and local vendor markets. They decided to host a neighborhood cleanup event, inviting customers and employees to work together to beautify the area around the store. On the day of the event, Steve joined the team as they planted flowers, painted benches, and picked up litter. By the end of the day, the store had not only improved its surroundings but also earned the goodwill of the community. The third store was struggling with internal conflict. Employees felt undervalued, and morale was at an all-time low. Steve spent a week observing and speaking with employees individually. He organized a team-building session, where they shared their frustrations and brainstormed solutions together. "Leadership isn't about fixing everything yourself," Steve told the manager, a reserved man named Greg. "It's about empowering your team to find solutions and supporting them along the way." By the time Steve left, Greg had a clearer vision of how to lead, and the employees felt hopeful for the first time in months. Back at Fresh Path, the team welcomed Steve home with open arms. "How's the rest of the company holding up without us?" Carlos joked. Steve laughed. "They've got a lot to learn, but they're on the right track. It made me appreciate even more what we've built here." Ellen, who had stopped by to hear about his travels, nodded in approval. "It sounds like you've not only helped others but also discovered how far your influence can reach." Steve smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment. "It's been an eye-opening experience. But no matter where I go, Fresh Path will always be where it all started." That evening, as Steve closed up the store, he stood at the entrance, watching the lights flicker on in the quiet parking lot. The journey had grown far beyond what he ever imagined, but it was rooted in the lessons he had learned here: humility, teamwork, and the power of community. Steve felt ready for whatever came next, knowing that Fresh Path would always be his foundation. The store had given him a second chance, and now he was determined to pay it forward, one connection, one store, one community at a time. As months passed, the impact of the Community First program spread across the company. Stores that had once struggled with morale and community connection were now finding their footing, inspired by the Fresh Path model. Steve continued to mentor managers and provide guidance, but his heart remained firmly rooted in the store where it all began. One crisp autumn morning, Steve arrived at Fresh Path to find Ellen waiting for him near the entrance. She had her familiar clipboard in hand, but there was something different in her demeanor, an air of seriousness beneath her usual warmth. "Ellen," Steve greeted her, "what brings you by so early?" Ellen gestured toward a bench near the store entrance. "Let's sit. I have something important to discuss with you." Curious and a little apprehensive, Steve followed her to the bench. As they sat, the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a golden glow over the parking lot. "Steve," Ellen began, her tone measured, "I've been thinking about the future of Fresh Path, my future, to be exact." Steve frowned slightly, unsure of what she meant. "Your future? What are you getting at, Ellen?" She smiled, though there was a trace of melancholy in her expression. "I've dedicated so much of my life to this store, to the people who work here and the community it serves. But I'm not getting any younger, and I think it's time for me to step back." The words hit Steve like a wave. Ellen had always been the guiding force behind Fresh Path, the steady presence that anchored its values. The idea of her leaving felt almost unthinkable. "You're retiring?" Steve asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Ellen nodded. "Yes. But this isn't the end, Steve. It's a new chapter, for me and for Fresh Path. And I already know who I want to take over my role." Steve stared at her, the realization dawning. "Ellen, I'm not sure I—" She raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "You're ready, Steve. I've watched you grow, seen how you've transformed this store and yourself. You've proven time and time again that you have what it takes to lead, not just with your head, but with your heart." Steve looked away, his thoughts swirling. "It's a big responsibility, Ellen. What if I can't live up to what you've built?" Ellen reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You won't be building what I've built. You'll be building what's next. That's the beauty of leadership, it evolves, just like you have." Over the following weeks, Ellen began transitioning her responsibilities to Steve. Together, they worked on every detail, from long-term strategies to the smallest nuances of community engagement. One afternoon, as they walked through the store, Ellen paused near the community corner. A group of children was seated on colorful mats, listening to a local storyteller as part of Fresh Path's literacy program. "This," Ellen said softly, gesturing to the scene, "is what it's all about. Not just the groceries or the numbers, but the lives we touch." Steve nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "I'll do everything I can to honor that, Ellen." "I know you will," she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. The day of Ellen's farewell arrived sooner than Steve had anticipated. The team organized a celebration in her honor, transforming the store's community space into a vibrant gathering filled with laughter, food, and heartfelt tributes. Maya stood on a makeshift stage, holding a microphone. "Ellen," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "you've been the heart of this store for so long. We're going to miss you more than words can say. But we know you're leaving us in good hands." She turned to Steve, grinning. "Well, mostly good hands. We'll keep an eye on him for you." The room erupted in laughter and applause, but Steve felt the weight of the moment. When it was Ellen's turn to speak, she stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the faces of the people she had guided for so many years. "Fresh Path has been more than a job to me," she began. "It's been a family, a purpose, and a source of joy. I see all of you, and I know that the store's future is bright, not because of what I've done, but because of what we've done together." She turned to Steve, her gaze steady. "And to Steve, I've seen you grow from someone searching for his place to someone who's found it. You have the heart and the vision to lead Fresh Path into its next chapter. I couldn't be prouder." The room burst into applause as Ellen hugged Steve, her smile unwavering. That night, after the celebration had ended, Steve stood alone in the store, the lights dimmed and the aisles quiet. Ellen's words echoed in his mind as he walked to the community corner, now empty but still radiating warmth. For the first time, Steve truly saw himself not just as part of Fresh Path, but as its steward, a responsibility he was ready to embrace. As he locked up and stepped into the cool night air, Steve felt a profound sense of purpose. Ellen had passed the torch, and now it was his turn to lead, to grow, and to ensure that Fresh Path continued to be a beacon of hope and connection for everyone who walked through its doors. The first week after Ellen's retirement was bittersweet for Steve. The store felt the weight of her absence, yet her influence lingered in every corner, in the way the employees worked together, in the warmth that greeted customers, and in the values that shaped every decision. Steve quickly settled into his new role as Fresh Path's leader, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. At their first team meeting under his leadership, he stood in front of the familiar group, the weight of responsibility tempered by his trust in them. "Ellen left us a legacy," Steve began, his voice steady. "It's not just the store, it's the sense of family, of purpose, of belonging. But legacies aren't meant to stay the same. They're meant to grow. That's what I want us to do, together." Carlos leaned back in his chair, smirking. "So, what's the plan, boss? What's the next big idea?" Steve grinned. "I'm glad you asked." Steve's first major initiative was inspired by one of Ellen's final conversations with him about the importance of growth. He proposed the Fresh Futures program, aimed at mentoring young people in the community and offering internships at the store. The team embraced the idea wholeheartedly, and within weeks, the program was up and running. High school students began shadowing employees, learning not just about retail operations but also about teamwork, leadership, and the importance of community. One of the first interns was a shy teenager named Mia. On her first day, she barely spoke, sticking close to Maya at the checkout lanes. "Don't worry," Maya whispered to her with a wink. "We were all new once. Just take it one step at a time." As the days passed, Mia began to find her footing. Steve made it a point to check in with her, offering encouragement and advice. "Mia," he said one afternoon as they stocked shelves together, "I see a lot of potential in you. Don't be afraid to speak up and share your ideas. This program is about learning, and we're here to support you." Mia nodded, her confidence slowly growing. The Fresh Futures program quickly became a cornerstone of FreshPath's identity. Customers often stopped to watch the interns at work, many expressing gratitude for the opportunities the store was creating. One afternoon, as Steve walked through the store, he overheard a customer talking to one of the interns. "This store is something special," the customer said. "It's not just about the groceries, it's about the people. You're lucky to be a part of it." Steve felt a swell of pride. FreshPath was living up to everything Ellen had envisioned and more. Months later, the store celebrated its annual Community Day, a tradition Ellen had started years ago. This year's event felt particularly meaningful, as it was the first without Ellen present. The store buzzed with activity as families participated in games, cooking demonstrations, and giveaways. Local vendors filled the parking lot, offering handmade goods and fresh produce. Steve stood near the main stage, watching the crowd with a sense of fulfillment. Maya approached him, holding a microphone. "You're up," she said with a grin, handing it to him. Steve climbed onto the stage, his heart pounding as the crowd quieted. "Thank you all for being here today," he began. "This store has always been more than just a place to shop. It's a place where we come together, support each other, and build something bigger than ourselves." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "Ellen Lawrence taught us that. She showed us the power of community, and while she's moved on to her well-deserved retirement, her spirit is in everything we do. Today, we honor her legacy by continuing to grow, to give, and to connect." The crowd erupted in applause, and Steve stepped down, feeling a deep sense of purpose. That evening, as the event wound down and the last customers left, Steve stood outside the store, watching the lights flicker off one by one. The FreshPath sign glowed softly in the dark, a beacon for the community it served. Ellen's voice echoed in his mind, "You'll be building what's next." Steve smiled, his heart full. FreshPath was more than just a second chance for him, it was a promise, a living testament to what people could achieve when they came together. He locked the doors and walked to his car, ready for the next day. Whatever challenges or opportunities lay ahead, he knew FreshPath, and the family they had built, would be ready.